So OPG is a multi-fuels company. We have 66 hydroelectric generating stations in Ontario. We have 2 large nuclear plants I referenced earlier, thermal stations that are converted, were used to burn coal and now burn biomass. And then through some subsidiaries, we have some small hydroelectric stations in the United States, and also some gas plants that we operate in Ontario through our subsidiary Atura Power. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, I think the push we've been seeing from so many corners on new nuclear is really about climate change and the need to reach our net zero goals. Fossil fuels were the workhorses of the electricity generation system in most of Canada for a very long time. And places that could build hydro generally did, and places that couldn't build enough often used coal or natural gas. And there was a bunch of advantages to that, including the fact that those were relatively inexpensive. But one of the reasons they were so inexpensive is that they externalized the cost of pollution. The gift and the curse of nuclear power is that we are responsible for every single speck of waste that we produce. And we know where it is, and we have to manage it forever. We don't just send it up a chimney and make it someone else's problem. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge, that you can't look at the need for nuclear without acknowledging that really a lot of it is driven by climate change and the need to supplement intermittent renewable power that you can get from things like solar and wind with some stable base load, particularly for places that aren't blessed with rich hydroelectric resources. Next slide, please. SMRs are exciting because they're building on what we already have in Canada in terms of the traditional nuclear gigawatt-sized plants. So those are plants that produce enough power, for a city of 1 million people, for example. Darlington alone has 4 units, and those 4 units together produce 20% of Ontario's entire electricity needs. That's pretty impressive when you think about that happening at a single facility. SMRs, in contrast, are smaller versions, simplified designs, built with a fleet approach in mind. So you get economies of scale in terms of training, operations, and maintenance. And so usually we talk about grid scale SMRs being in that 300 megawatt range. That's about enough power for a city of 300,000 people. Next slide, please. This slide just gives you a little bit more information about how SMRs are different from conventional reactors. Smaller footprint physically, smaller output of electricity, better fit for when you're looking at replacing coal plants that you're retiring, in terms of them being around the same size. So you can take advantage of existing transmission infrastructure, lower upfront capital investment, etc. Next slide, please. So OPG is really working on 3 different types of SMRs, or what we call 3 different streams. So on-grid SMRs, like the one we're building at Darlington, grid scale, 300 megawatts. We're using the GE Hitachi boiling water technology. It's essentially a scaled down version of types of reactors that have been in use in the United States for many years. So that's stream 1. Then advanced reactors, you've got manufacturers like ARC, Moltex, and X Energy that can do really neat things, including particularly on the heat side. So if you need heat for industrial processes that are otherwise very hard to decarbonize, things like smelting, oil sands extraction, chemical production, potash mining, those advanced reactors show a lot of promise there. And some of them, like the Moltex design, can even reuse used fuel from CANDU reactors, thereby reducing the total volume of used fuel waste, which is really exciting. And then the third stream, we have these off-grid SMRs, or often called micromodular reactors. So significantly smaller than the grid scale ones. We're talking about 5 megawatts instead of 300, for example. And the market for that is really mines and communities that are not currently connected to provincial transmission grids. And an example there is the Global First Power Demonstration Project that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Next slide, please. On our grid scale reactor at Darlington, we have passed a couple of key milestones. We just submitted our license to construct. And following that, we'll start building the reactor and plan to turn it on and have it producing electricity before the end of this decade. So that's pretty exciting, and it aligns really nicely with Sask Power's own timeline. In some ways, we go first and de-risk the technology for Sask Power and really set us up for that fleet approach for maintenance and operations, which is quite exciting. The CANDU reactors that we've had and we still operate in Ontario are great, safe, reliable workhorses, but they're very large. They're fairly complex, and they require a large number of people to operate them. So it's exciting to think that we will move away from those kind of bespoke, only of a kind designs to something that is more like what we take for granted when you're bringing in your car to get serviced. If the mechanic is working on my 2009 Camry and Travis's, then they don't have to, read a book between appointments. They know what to expect when they open the hood, and we're aiming for something similar in terms of the fleet approach to SMRs. Next slide, please. So the BWRX 300, as I said earlier, essentially a scaled down version of a larger reactor that we've seen for a long time. It's a light water, boiling water reactor, as opposed to the CANDUs, which are heavy waters reactors. And it's got a really nice long 80-year operational life. So, these are reactors that you will put into service and then we can rely on for a very long time, which is exciting. Unlike the CANDUs, they don't require a midlife refurbishment to get that many decades out of. So that's quite promising. Next slide, please. I did speak a little bit about the advanced reactors. So OPG recently made an investment in X Energy just earlier this week, actually. So that's exciting. We see the X Energy advanced reactor being particularly attractive for those industrial process uses, and we've got a lot of interest in Western Canada, in Alberta in particular, but also in Saskatchewan, for how those could be very helpful in decarbonizing oil sands extraction, for example, or helpful in potash mining. Next slide, please. Then off-grid, the Global First Power Project. We've got our commercial demonstration. You see the little rendering of what it might look like at Chalk River. And then, below that, you can see that the reactor is actually designed to be placed below grade. And that design has a bunch of neat features from a non-proliferation perspective, but also quite helpful from a safety perspective. You can imagine, for example, if the remote area that you deploy these reactors to had to be evacuated because of wildfires. Even if you lost the entire balance of plant above the ground, the reactor would sort of basically go into a safe storage kind of hibernation and just hang out there safely, not requiring any intervention until you needed to restart it again. Next slide, please.
Sure. While I'm switching slides, I see we got our first question in the QA box here.
Oh, excellent.
It was wondering if we have good numbers for the CapEx and the OpEx.
Great question. So I would say the honest answer is no. And that's one of the reasons that these commercial demonstration projects like the Global First Power one at Chalk River and the first of a kind build at Darlington are so important. People have been talking about small modular reactors for a very long time, but it's been very difficult to pin down exactly, okay, great. If I want to buy one, when can it be ready and how much is it going to cost? And so we're getting closer and closer to being able to answer that question. I think probably I think we have good guesses, but we're going to be narrowing in on those increasingly as we get closer and closer to turning them on. To give you a sense of the Chalk River project, micro modular reactor, I think that that capital cost of constructing it will probably be around, let's say, between 200 and 300 million, and then the operating cost over a 20-year life cycle would be roughly the same. And if you had a shorter life cycle, it would be a bit lower. So just to give you kind of round numbers. On Darlington, we're talking about billions rather than hundreds of billions, rather than hundreds of millions. But I wouldn't want to give you a number there. That's not my project directly, and I don't want to get my knuckles wrapped for giving an incorrect number in public, because people always remember those numbers and hold you to them. So I'm not going to take a risk on that one. In terms of sort of going back to the slides, we'll of course welcome any other questions you might have. Indigenous communities are extremely important to OPG, as I know they are to SaskPower. We do have a reconciliation action plan where we are really trying to not just make commitments at the high level, but get granular in terms of what we're going to be doing in terms of spending, in terms of partnerships, and in terms of spending money with Indigenous-owned businesses, for example. And that way we put those measures out there and we can be held accountable to them as to whether or not we reach our targets. And that's something that we're quite excited about, and have had some really good discussions around potential Indigenous partnerships on the ownership side, for example, when we're looking at new nuclear at Darlington, or Indigenous economic community benefits that would flow from our Chalk River project. So that is a real priority for us, as I know it is also for SaskPower.